So I'm going to talk today about the history of the Narragansett Times. And the history of the Times is really the history of the Wakefield-Narragansett community. And it's also the history of what's happened to journalism in the last 50 years. We're going to see the incredible growth of the paper, and we're going to see some of the headwinds that it's experienced in the last few decades. I'd like to dedicate this talk to all the people who crossed that threshold of the Times building at what was 854 Main Street, now it's 187, and 886, which was the editorial building. A finer group of people you could not meet, incredibly hardworking. I was talking to somebody who worked at the paper years ago, and he was reminiscing about sleeping on the floor on deadline night. I never slept on the floor, but we came close a few times. So the thread, I think, running through this is going to be the dedication of the people on the paper to bring the news to the public, and the receptivity of the public to hearing about that news and wanting to know more about what's going on in the community. So this is the very first issue of the Narragansett Times. You'll notice there's no "the" on the flag. It's just Narragansett Times. The date is May 5th, 1855, and there's this very interesting motto, truth against error, victory or death, which sounds a little bit like live free or die. Within a year, the publishers had changed that. You'll notice that the publisher is Thomas P. Wells. It's not Duncan Gillies, who liked to fashion himself as the founder of the Narragansett Times. And a lot of the histories that I read that were compiled years later basically talked about the paper from 1858 forward, which is like when he got involved. So there was a little revisionist history here that I think was going on. In fact, it was Thomas P. Wells who was the first publisher for a couple of years. And in some of the histories, it claims that Wells's paper was called the South County Journal, but I've not been able to find any editions of something called the South County Journal. And this is May 5th, 1855, and the motto over the door always was since 1855. So I think that this is pretty accurate, that this is the origin of the paper. The first issue, as typical of papers of that time, we have some stories that have been improved from other publications. We have some fiction, we have some poetry. We have just sort of a mishmash of stuff on the front page, and the local news doesn't come until the interior of the paper. It's 4 pages, that's all their hand-fed press with comedy. So here's a rough timeline of the early years. In 1855, the first issue appears. In 1860, the paper moves to what they called Armstrong Corner, which actually is what we would call Columbia Corner today, in April of 1860. And Duncan Gillies had gotten involved probably around 1858 in the paper because he had a lot of printing experience. But then he decides to go back to Scotland, maybe because the Civil War had broken out. And then the paper is run by Thomas P. Wells in that interim. It's somebody named David Dunlop, who I haven't been able to find out much about. 1864, Gillies returned. And then at one point in 1878, Gillies and Spencer were listed as publishers. So every once in a while, he would take in other people as partners. But from 1858 on, he's sort of the common thread. He's gone for those 3 years, but then he comes back. This is the man, Duncan Gillies, very serious-looking Scotsman. He was born on August 6, 1830 in Scotland, and I'll show you a little map of that in a second. His father was a printer. He did extensive printing work in New York and New Jersey before he came to Wakefield in 1856. So he was perhaps more experienced than Thomas Wells. He certainly was a very familiar hand around a paste-up room, around the press room. So this is a map of Scotland, and right about here is where he was from. And you can see, this is Ireland, okay? You can see how it's surrounded by water. So I think that the Rhode Island climate was probably something that he really felt comfortable with. It was probably, it was a fishing community. So I think there was something about Rhode Island that probably attracted him. So in 1858, he signed an agreement with 3 other people. And it's interesting because it shows that this is how they divvied up the duties, okay? So he was in charge of composition and prep work, that's prep work for the press, folding, wrapping, and mailing the papers, Somebody named Church, who I think his name is Isaac, but you'll see the signature's kind of hard to read. He was both soliciting subscriptions and going out and covering town meetings and court hearings and other local news. So the wall between advertising and editorial that we always observed did not exist, apparently, in this time. And then Albert Palmer was in charge of editorial matters and correspondence, whatever that means. And Wells, who had been the original publisher, he was doing the financial stuff, and he was also doing proofreading. So, I mean, the spirit of everybody sort of chipping in, that never really went away at the Times, but you can see that they didn't have any sense of that maybe the business side should be staying away from the news coverage. This is the agreement that they signed. This was June 7th, 1858. This, like many of the images, came from the South County History Center. They have this whole handwritten in cursive agreement. It's wonderful. This is the building that Gillies built in 1868. It cost him $12,000, and it was more than just a newspaper. There was a bowling alley in it, and this was in the same spot as the paper is now. Okay, there was at least one tenement or apartment. There was a Freemasons hall. There was a public meeting space that people could use, and the Times office, I think, was on the first floor. So the view here is looking down Columbia Street, kind of towards the high school, from, I believe, from what we would now see as Woodruff Avenue. Unless maybe that's Main Street. I'm not entirely positive, but I think that that's looking down towards Columbia. So disaster strikes. On April 10th, 1880, someone set a fire in the basement of the building. A tailor in the building who was working very late sewing something or mending something was the first to notice the fire. He raises the alarm. Of course, back then, this is 1880. They don't have the equipment that we have today to extinguish a fire. They probably had some sort of hand pumper. They would have to get water from some kind of, the river or whatever. The building was completely destroyed. The Times lost nearly everything. Somebody ran in and grabbed some of their business books, some of their accounting books. They lost the presses, they lost their type, their lithography stones, their plates, engravings, everything. So it was pretty quickly assumed that it had been arson. And Gillies, from what's in the paper, I think Gillies knew who did it, okay? Because he hints that in the editorial columns of the paper pretty heavily. But to his chagrin, the local district attorney wants Gillies himself to hire a lawyer or a detective to gather the evidence and give it to the state to press charges. And now, keep in mind, Gillies just had these, he lost he told his loss at about $10,000 at that point, depreciating the building. He's in no position, the building was not well insured, so he's very upset about this. So I looked through some of the papers. Who would be mad at Duncan Gillies? He made an enemy, who did he make? So a day before the fire broke out, in the issue of the Times, there was a tongue-in-cheek story about 3 arsonists who had been brought before the district court in what was the new town hall. They called it the townhouse on High Street. It just opened. And the article makes fun of their Irish accents. There were 3 of them who had been called to appear. One of them didn't show up. One of them was sent to the workhouse, whatever that was. And I don't know what happened to the third one. So one of them wasn't there. One of them's in jail, and then the third one, I don't know who that was. I don't even think it named who they were. But okay, there's some people who might be a little upset about the paper, and they happen to be arsonists. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. But he also had some other people who could have been upset with him. There was supposedly he had a little dispute with some of the temperance folk who were meeting in the Freemasons Hall, and they accused him of liking to take a sip now and then. Certain malt beverages were popular in the town that he was from, so that might have been true. And there was also a story in February. So the fire occurred in April. There was a story in February. It doesn't say where this stable is, but it says this Hayden & Sons stable had burned, and a suspected embittered employee. And the headline, ironically, on the story was it retribution? Which is the question that must have been going through Gilly's mind when his own place burned down. And then on April 2nd, he printed this whole story about some corruption in the governor's race and said he would be willing to pay someone money if they could come up with evidence that it had taken place. So there were definitely some controversial things that were in the paper that might have led somebody to go into the basement of the building and torch the place. So after several weeks of Gillies writing these stories, hinting at who it might be, right? Roland Hazard writes him a letter, and he basically says, you need to knock this off, right? He says you can't be casting strong suspicions against certain parties, and you cannot scold people into patronizing your printing office. I fear very much that this publication has injured you greatly. And he gave him the same advice, hire a detective. Well, maybe if he had put his money where his mouth was and given him some money, Roland Hazard had plenty of money, he could have hired a detective. As it was, Hazard does loan Gillies money to replace the building. So that's something. And this is the more modest building, one-story building that's built in place of what had been there. So he gets a loan from Roland Hazard. The new building only costs a little over $1,000 versus $12,000 for the first one. And so, Gillies is not in a good position here. He's definitely, he's probably overextended at this point, and he's probably very dismayed by what's happening. So a few months after the fire, they move into the new building. It goes up very quickly. Fires in June, fires in April, they move in June. D.R. Southwick, one of the Southwicks, a very South County name, built the building, which is still standing today, and they never missed an issue. They went somewhere else to print, I'm not sure exactly where, but they never missed an issue because of the arson. This is the interior of that building. This is very interesting. I'm going to talk about the technology a little bit later in the talk, but this is a typical press room in the hot lead days. Their press would have been very small. You can see that there are slugs of type on that table there. I think the press is in the back towards the right. That's probably the press. It looks like there's a drum back there. It's kind of hard to see. Someone's coat is hanging up right there. This is probably the back of the building. As you're looking towards us, where we are. This is a place where work happens. This is not a tidy office, because the hot lead days, this was dirty business, right? This is the actual agreement of Duncan Gillies paying $1,000, and it says how many windows and doors he paid for. It says he only bought 4 windows. I wonder if they were able to salvage some, because there's clearly more than 4 windows in the building and in that picture that I just showed you. Right down to the number of bricks and the chimney and whatnot, and he pays it in full, probably with that loan from Hazard. So in 1881, the Times begins printing a daily paper in Narragansett. So it's just a year later, and the trajectory of this paper in Narragansett is very similar to the trajectory of Narragansett as a resort. It follows sort of the heyday of Narragansett Pier as a very stylish resort, and they stopped publishing it in 1925. After the income tax was enacted in 1911, I think it was, a lot of these resorts started to go downhill. And Reverend George Utter, who's probably related to the Utters of Westerly, also had started something called the Narragansett Weekly in 1861, which I don't know a lot about, but this is probably in response to it. This daily paper, this was only daily in season. This wasn't all year round. This would have been, and this is the prospectus that appeared a week before. The first issue was June 27th. And on June 17th, they printed this prospectus, and they basically say, the time has come, we believe, when the progressive spirit of the pier should make another step in advance. The people who own property in and around the village cannot afford to remain dormant in face of the strong rivalry of other southern resorts. So they're framing this almost as kind of an economic development thing, because also it's going to have a lot of advantages to that. For a long time, the newspaper's offices in Narragansett were in the Hazard Block, and some of you may know that went up in smoke on September 12, 1900, when the Rockingham Hotel and that whole block burned. So I don't know what they lost there. There's no press in that building. It was probably just paperwork and records and whatnot. This is Duncan Gilley's house. This house is still standing. This is where Potter Sunoco is now, and it was moved to face Woodruff Avenue. It's right behind where Potter Sunoco is. I'm not sure when he built it, but it looks like it's kind of a center chimney colonial, so it's probably sometime maybe in the 1860s or 1870s that he built it. And then the Gilleys, I believe, also built these two houses. The one in the foreground is an apartment building, 49 Woodruff, and 475 is where I lived for 25 years. I'm almost positive that the Gilleys lived in 49. 475 might have been some employees of theirs. I'm not sure about that. Interestingly, the late Matt Wunsch who was editor of the Narragansett Times, lived in 49 for a while. And of course, when I was editor, I was living in 475. So these houses have this real connection to the paper. And for a while, I was sort of in a little competition with Tom Kleinwasser as to who lived closest to the Times. He lived on Prospect Street, Prospect Avenue, and walked to work every day of his career. But I could see the Times outside my window, so I was just a little bit closer. So Duncan Gilleys passed away shortly after the fire, and on August 16, 1881. He was only 51. He'd been sick for a while. You know, it's tempting to think that probably shortened his life. It was probably a very upsetting thing. His son John took over the business, and in his obituary, which was probably written by John or one of the sons, his pen was a facile one, but he never descended to toadyism. I would agree with that. I think he was very outspoken based on some of the things that were in some of those columns. His wife, Elizabeth, lived much longer than he did. She lived until 1903. So they had 6 children: John, Bessie, Duncan Jr., Archie, Roderick, and Margaret. Now, Bessie, I couldn't find her anywhere. I'm like, what happened to her? Because in some of the later statements of ownership, all the other kids are in there. She's not there. Well, she was married in 1885, and less than a month after she married, she died suddenly. They were living with I guess it must have been his mother, because the father was dead at this point. And she'd been having some fainting spells. She collapsed. They thought maybe she'd hit her head, and she died. And John ends up naming one of his daughters Bessie, which was very confusing to me until I kind of unraveled what happened to the original Bessie. So John, Duncan Jr., Archie, Roderick, and Margaret are going to maintain an interest in the paper. But John's the one who's running it. He's the publisher, he's the editor, and the business manager. So this is what happened to all of them. In 1921, John died, and the business went to Archie, or Archibald. When he died 4 years later, Roderick and Duncan Jr. together took it over, and they branded themselves D. Gilley's Sons. That's what they call the company. And they're going to sell it in 1946, but Duncan Jr. lives to 1953, and Roderick lived to 1960, so he lived to a good old age. Some of the employees that I found in the papers, some familiar names. These are during the Gilleys years. George Gardner was a compositor at the early part of the 20th century. John Phillips, I think, was some kind of reporter. He was in Westerly covering some big story. The Westerly Sun noted in 1928. And Frank Ferry's name comes up a lot. He was a justice of the peace, and one account says he was an employee of the Times for nearly half a century. So he might have been a compositor, pressman, or something like that. Now we come to the Wilson years. In 1946, Frederick Wilson Jr. buys a paper for $29,500 from the Gilleys family. The torch is now passed from one family to the other. He was a Navy veteran of World War II. He was a graduate of Rhode Island State College, which is now URI. And for a while, he even continued to teach accounting at the college after he bought the paper. Famously, some of the financial support he got was from Senator John F. Kennedy. He was the senator at the time. They knew each other, and he loaned Wilson $2,000. He also received a $2,000 loan from Mary Carpenter, interestingly, and Industrial National Bank. This is one of the stock certificates, and he was listed for a very short period of time as a vice president of the company, but the money was paid back very quickly. So his involvement with the paper There was always a picture of him in Rick Wilson's office, and there was always that sense that he'd been part of the beginning, which was really cool. But he was really only financially involved for a short time. For the next 50 years, under the leadership of Fred and then his sons, the paper's going to go through unprecedented expansion. As early as 1950, they're publishing this tourism magazine, somewhat glossy for the time. They joined what was then called the New England Weekly Press Association, and they start winning awards. Now, Frederick Wilson Jr., was both publisher and editor at this time. There's no one else who's editing the paper, he's doing it all, okay? He was elected director of New England Weekly Press Association. He was heavily involved in this organization. In 1962, he hires Jerry Goldstein to be a reporter, and eventually Jerry will be made the editor of the paper. I just want to take you through the technology now of how quickly or how extensively it changed. So if we start over there, we have, in 1855, they have a hand-fed press that can do 4 pages, okay? By 1868, they have a steam-powered Hoe press, H-O-E. It can do 1,000 to 1,200 copies an hour, which is probably pretty significant for the time. Eventually, that becomes electric-powered. They buy their first linotype machine, and this is actually from the front page of the paper the day they announced it, in 1928. Okay, so this is all Gillies, people. Now, in 1968, Fred buys a web offset press, a 3-unit Cottrell press. It can do 15,000 copies an hour. Big, big change, okay? And then a few years later, they upgrade so that they add a deck so they can do color. Now, they weren't really doing color. I'll talk about that in a second. But they had the capability, certainly, to do spot color and advertising. In 1967, they added on to the building to accommodate this much bigger press. So that concrete block addition, that sort of L addition, that was added in 1967 to accommodate the press, and according to the building permit, it cost $9,000. Now, a huge sea change is going to happen when the paper starts being printed off-site. Okay, so Rick partnered with 2 other companies, the Observer and the Spectator of Somerset, Mass., and they created something called Narragansett Publishing, and we always just called it NPI, and it was in Quonset, and its Harris offset press could print 20,000 copies an hour. So by 1980, we're going from in like 80 years, they've gone from 120 years. They've gone from this hand-fed press to now being able to print 20,000 copies an hour. But even this press, with all its capabilities, is not going to be able to handle the unprecedented growth of the paper that's going to take place in the 1980s, and that's why the Narragansett Times and the Standard became twice-weekly publications, because they could only, I think they could do 24-page sections, maybe something like that, because the press couldn't handle it. The paper was too big. They had too many ads, which, I mean, oh my God, should we have this problem today, right? They had so many classified ads, they had so many display ads, they couldn't print the paper anymore. So I just wanted to take you a little through the deadline situation, as I recall it. In the NPI era, which is when I was hired, they had just started, a couple of years before, they just started taking papers to NPI. The paper left the building at 11 a.m. Thursday. So we would stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning doing all of our editorial work, getting the stories done and edited. And then we would have to be back, I think it's 7 or 7:30 in the morning, to write the headlines and lay out the pages. It left the building and went to Quonset at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was back by 4 o'clock for distribution. Now, when Capital Cities, which I'll talk about in a minute, buys the paper, okay, this is what I call the Giros era, because we used, my husband's laughing, because we 8:30 p.m. was the deadline on Wednesday night, so you can see that's a little, they rolled it backward a bit. We would get the paper out, we would all go to Giro's for, it was like $3 spaghetti night or whatever on Wednesdays, right? And we would hang out at Giro's afterwards. And the paper would come back, I think it actually came back at like 3 in the morning or something. It was being printed in Connecticut then. And then in the Journal Register era, you can see it keeps getting worse, okay? The paper left at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays and returned the next day. And then we were being printed at the New Haven Register. And it was a really onerous deadline, and I can remember Jim Fiore, who was, worked in the composing room, said to me one day, "Let me take you to the New Haven Register, and I'll show you around." He's like, "Gonna be a big shot, right?" Well, it was a setup, right? He gets me over there, and every single person I talked to said, "You know, you have to read your deadline. How come you're not reading your deadline?" I don't think I talked to him at all on the ride home. It was a long ride home. It was pretty mad. But from having up till 11 o'clock on Thursday to get a story in the paper, and now it's 3 o'clock the day before, it wasn't an improvement, it was just the opposite. So the hot type era ended really before I got there. This is the equipment that we had when I was there in the 80s. This is called the MDT 350. It's a disc-based, oh my God, it looks so primitive. But this is what we had. It was a disc-based composing machine. It kind of looks like a typewriter. It had a little screen, and you would put in your little floppy disk, you would type your story, and then you take the floppy disk out, you put it in a little sleeve, and you write down the name of the story, you get it to your editor to edit. And along the way, and then he'd go to another machine and put it in the machine. Along the way, inevitably, the disk would get corrupted, and the story would get lost. We didn't have any kind of connectivity at all. But this was the latest technology at the time. And the Times was a beta site for Compographic, which is this tech firm in Boston that provided equipment like this, and we also had this big processor where the stories were processed. And they came out on these sheets that you would have to wax and put on and paste up here. And we had this headline machine that, I don't know who designed this, but it wasn't somebody who wrote headlines, because it was completely blind. It was this machine, and inside there was a drum, and there were 2 fonts on the drum. They were these negative strips. So the top font might be something we're using in the paper, like Century School Book. And the bottom font was something the ad department was using, like Rhonda or Honda or some crazy thing. So if you didn't toggle the right toggle, you would type like 20 headlines, and it would come out in this wacky font, and you'd have to rip it up. Or if you're typing it, and you make a typographical error, you have no idea, you can't see it. You have to take out the little cartridge, and you put it through this developer, and you pull it out, and as it's coming out, you're reading it, and you hear people start swearing away. Damn ad department, right? I have to start over. It was really primitive, but it was the latest thing, right? So Jerry Goldstein, so to go back to where I was, to talk about some of the people, Jerry Goldstein was hired in 1962, and he was just an editorial employee doing reporting. He didn't have a title at first, I don't think. He told me he made $80 a week, and he did everything. He covered all the boards and commissions in South Kingston and Narragansett. He laid out the paper. He wrote the editorials. He wrote the headlines. He did the layout, and he had to do circulation. Thursdays. He would go around with like 700 papers and drop them off at all these businesses for $80 a week. And I said to him, well, 20 years later, I was hired for $180 a week. So I guess that was progress, right? He was eventually promoted to assistant editor in the 60s, and then in 1969, he was named editor. And the reason he was named editor is because, well, I'll get to this. So in 1969, the paper takes its first step towards expanding by buying the Woodford Standard. And there was a paper in North Kingston. They renamed it the North Kingstown Standard Times to have this branding of the Times. And they hired Rudy Hemby to be the editor. Because he was being called the editor, Fred Wilson had to now relinquish the editing title he himself was still using and give it to Jerry Goldstein for equity, because Jerry was really editing the paper at that point. So Rudy and Jerry were very close friends. They used to meet after deadline when they were competing against each other and trade stories and see who would beat who with what. So they did actually work together for a few years, and Rudy became the editor of the Standard, and then he was promoted to managing editor of the company in 1976 when Dan Mackey became editor of the Standard. So what we see now is we see this great period of editorial expansion. Okay, we see sports and the arts, and all these sections start to appear. That stuff that had maybe been covered a little bit was kind of willy-nilly in the paper. Pete Fontaine was the paper's first sports editor. This is one of his columns. It's called The Sports Scenes, 1970. It's about the time I think he started. I couldn't really pinpoint the exact date. He was succeeded by Jim Campanini, and then Tim Cotter, Tom Gardner, Gavin Keefe, who's here today, Tony Roche, Mick Colagio, and many others. And the sports staff, eventually it was just like 3 or 4 people. It was pretty robust, and the sports coverage was not only text, but it was also great photography. This is an award-winning sports photo by Bob Emerson, who was named Photographer of the Year. And this appeared in the Standard Times. Bob Emerson was the first real full-time photographer that the paper had. And once all this stuff starts to happen, as you're going through the papers, you can just see it just becoming so great, right? And the images were so much a part of what made that paper great. Photography was just amazing. And this is when, I think this is 1972, Bob Emerson was named Photographer of the Year by the New England, they changed the name of it, yeah, it was, they called it New England Photographer of the Year, but that was me, but New England Press Association. He eventually became a TV videographer. Dan Dunn started, I first found his photo credit in 1975, so I think it's about the time that he started. This is when he was named Photographer of the Year. During this period of time, in the 1970s, the paper is going to these conventions, and they are cleaning up with awards. They're winning writing awards, they're winning awards for imagery, they're winning awards for their editorials, for their design. The Narragansett Times is developing a reputation as one of the best weekly newspapers in New England, and that's not puffery, that's true. These are some of the photos of Dan Dunn. Just an amazing photographer. I worked with him for years, and then he joined us at the Independent and also worked with us there. This is pretty early, this is 1978, when he was named Photographer of the Year. Ray Clayton was another great photographer at the Times. And this particular, I found this photo spread, and I just love it because it just shows the value that Ray brought to the paper and the time he would spend with people. He went to the Parrot North. The Parrot North was the sort of dive bar in Peacedale. And at some point, I think there was like a murder there or something. I don't know. But anyway, one of the editors must have said, they were having trouble getting that liquor license renewed. And they must have said to Ray, why don't you go hang out at the Parrot North and take some pictures? Or maybe it was his idea. And so he takes these wonderful pictures. And this is what he had to say, and I just think this is so wonderful. To say that the Parrot North is only a bar is just as accurate or inaccurate as saying that Phil's is only a diner. Or that Healy's is only a newspaper store. Each exists to fulfill in some way the needs of a segment of the community. The proof is in its existence. Oh my God, that is so awesome. I mean, you could also say that about the Times. The Times wasn't just a newspaper. It was a part of the thread of the community. And Ray got that. He brought this diversity to the paper that was very important. And I've been on many photo shoots with him, and he had this very patient way of really getting to know people that he shot. And both he and Danny were just wonderful to work with. And there were many other fine photographers, like Solano, many other fine photographers that we had. In 1975, at the time, Arlene Aces Fleming starts the first art section in the paper. And this is going to become a very robust part of what the Narragansett Times is. Movie reviews, stage reviews, advances, stories about people. It's really full arts and entertainment section. This is one of the earliest ones in November 1975. Of course, Arlene went on to have a long career. She went to the Providence Journal for many years, won awards. She was inducted into the Rhode Island Press Association Hall of Fame, as was Ray. And she was known as just really one of the finest writers at the Journal. But she started that, and eventually the art section changed a little bit. Jane Blackwood redubbed it Time Out. I think that was around the time the papers went twice a week. But it's always been a really important part of the paper. So they bought the Standard, they branch out some more. In 1977, they create the Charitable Times. This is the first time they're creating a publication from scratch, right? It's a really brave thing to do. And Brian Mitchell is the editor. this is the very first other times it ever appeared in the paper, which I just stumbled on, which, if you don't remember other times, it was this column that was written by the reporters. And it was, sometimes they were great and sometimes they weren't, right? But people took turns, like every few weeks it would be your turn, you'd come up with, and Brian wrote the very first one, which I didn't know. So he was a reporter at the Narragansett Times. He was named to be editor of the Charitable Times, and very quickly starts covering the proposed nuclear power plant in Charlestown. One of the first things he did is he went to Vernon, Vermont, to interview people near the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. He was there for a week. I don't know any publisher that sent anybody anywhere for a week today. And so the Wilsons were really investing in the content of the paper. That was the secret to their success. They always invested in the content of the paper. Charitable Times did not last. It was resurrected and it was just recently killed again. It's a tough climate out there. There's not as much advertising as there is in Wakefield and Narragansett. Unfortunately, we had a recession shortly after the Charitable Times started, which didn't help matters any. So there were declining ad revenues. When I was at the paper, we resurrected it in 1993, and it lasted for quite a while, but it was just recently closed. So I'm going to talk about the family, the Wilson family, a little bit. It's a really important part of the story. The Wilson children were involved in the paper from a very young age. This is just a couple of examples. Rick told me he worked for Tom Weiser in advertising production when he was a kid. He covered sports, he wrote a fishing column. Sally did everything at the paper, just about everything. She sold advertising, she did proofreading, she filled in for people. As an adult, she wrote this beloved column, South County Kitchen. People would clip her recipes. Everybody, I'm sure all the kids in that family worked at the paper one time or another. But there was this real investment by the family. It was a family operation. So in 1971, Rick was not involved in the paper at that point. He comes back to work with his father selling advertising, and his wife Shannon dies very suddenly, living with three children. And I always have thought that Rick's attitude towards his female employees who were having children was because he himself had been a single parent. He was he let me job share after I had my last child. Mary Beth Riley reviewed my job share, and I always thought that his sensitivity on that issue was because he had been in that position and he understood what that was like. So he sells advertising first, he's later named assistant publisher, and then his father dies at the age of 62 in 1978, and Rick becomes editor. And this is the passing of, from one person to somebody else. This is the passing to the sons, okay? So Rick is named publisher, and then a year later, James P. Wilson comes aboard as his co-publisher. He brings a lot of marketing and business experience to the job. So Rick was always the editorial guy. He was very committed to the editorial side of the business. He was very interested in the editorial side of the business. Jamie was the one who had the hand on the money, right? and it was a good partnership. And they were both there when I was hired. There were some challenging times that happened in the 1980s. And these are just a few of them. In 1981, the paper undergoes, there's an attempt to unionize the employees. It fails on a tie vote. And for a while, that kind of split the company up, I think. I came on after that had happened, but there was still some bitterness, But the company did recover, and people did get over it. People got over it. There were 2 libel suits in the 1980s. The paper was victorious in both cases. They were both really baseless. But libel suits cost money to defend. And Rick always used to tell me, our law, we have a deductible on our libel insurance. It's $25,000. We can't afford to have a libel suit. So that was always top of mind for me. The Charitable Times had been sued over a remark in a story about George Martin, who owned most of Shannon at the time, saying something to the effect of there was a rumor in the village that he was responsible for setting fires or something. It was clear from the story that nobody really believed that, but he did sue. The jury found him favor of the paper. Okay, that's good. A flea market operator in 1985, during a council meeting, somebody had said something to the effect of, oh, those flea markets, they're all fencing stolen goods or something like that. This was at a council meeting. And the paper, I think, editorialized on it or wrote a story about it, and the flea market guy sued, but Judge Needham threw it out of Superior Court because it's a privileged environment. Just as Congress is a privileged environment, the court is so as would be a town council meeting. The most serious thing that happened in the 1980s was Rick's accident. This was a very dark day at the paper. I remember it vividly. I don't know what day of the week it was, but somehow we got word. This is before cell phones. Before cell phones, we had a scanner. I don't think that's how we found out. I think somebody called us because Rick had a car with a license plate N times. And I think somebody who went by the accident called us. He was coming from MPI. He was on Route 2 in North Kingstown, and a car coming the other way had swerved to avoid somebody and pushed this other car into the lane of travel, struck him head on. He was seriously injured, and I remember Tim and Rudy went to the hospital. He was at South County at first, and we all just were sort of waiting to find out. I mean, we didn't know he was going to live. It was really bad, and Tim came back and he said, it was bad, and I said, how is Nancy holding up? And he said, well, she's crying, but she's holding up, and it was just one of those moments when everything just sort of stops. Everything just stopped, and that was the only thing that mattered. And fortunately, he made a great recovery. He was a very strong person. We were sure he was going to be able to walk again, and he was able to play golf. So eventually, he did recover, but it was a very dark day for him. The paper passed out of family hands in 1983. There was an internal family dispute, and eventually they decided they were going to sell the paper. Ted Holmberg of the PB Times bid $1 million. The sons, Jamie and Rick, offered to buy out their mother, but eventually Capital Cities Communications bid $1.2 million, and they were successful bidders. And we were all sort of, wringing our hands about this. Jamie left the company, and with Wakefield Printing and buying Manfred Printing in Westerly from Narragansett Graphics, very successful business. Rick stayed on as publisher. Actually, of all the people who could have bought us at that time, Capital Cities was probably the best choice. They were very hands-off. They invested money in, we would go to conferences, professional development. I mean, they would give Rick a budget, and as long as he abided by it, that was it. There was no, they didn't get involved in our editorial decisions. It was nothing like that. So even though we were kind of chagrined by the fact Rick was still there, he was a stabilizing influence, it didn't really have a negative effect. And in 1984, we were able to buy, the paper was able to buy the Rhode Island Pendulum. They changed the name to the East Greenwich Pendulum. Anthony Farrell, whose editor, stayed on. So now they've got Pendulum, they've got Standard, Charitable Times, we've got 4 papers in the Narragansett Times. Eventually, there'll be 5 papers when they start the Coventry Courier. And in 1988, that's when the Narragansett Times goes twice a week, as does the Standard for a period of about 5 years. And then there's not as much need for that paper to be twice a week. It's not quite as big, and that goes back to a weekly Thursday paper in 1993. Once the Charitable Times is started again, we've got these 5. So the advantage to that is they can sell advertising for this huge area, right? The classified advertising is reaching from Westerly to Coventry, huge advantage. Then in 1995, the Journal Register Company of New Jersey purchased the paper from Capital Cities. They already owned the Call and Socket and the Pawtucket Times. Rick stays on for a short period of time. This is near the end of my time there as well. It was a very difficult period. This company was completely different from Cap Cities. They were totally bottom line people, and they were not at all interested in investing in editorial product. Rick left after 7 months, and then I left after like a year and 2 months after that. And so I got another job, and then I hear that Rick's talking about starting another paper, and I wanted in, because I wasn't really happy with what was happening at the Times, and so we started he started the Independent, and I was fortunate enough to work there for many years, and we had the Northeast Independent, was separate for quite a while. And today, the Times Group owns the Independent, which is kind of ironic, right? They bought the Narragansett Times Group in 2007. So this is just sort of a highlight reel of things that are fun to look at, okay? Just these are a few things. Times the paper got in trouble, right? Or was recognized, was written about. The first time is the Times was actually credited with coming up with the idea of building the junior high school and Southwood School on this diamond land in South Kingston, which actually ended up happening. That was after Wakefield School had burned to the ground in 1963. It was right after that. So probably that was Jerry's idea, I would imagine. Jerry was at a carnival on Boone Street in Narragansett, and shocked he is that gambling's going on. They've got this $2 roulette wheel, and so Jerry finds the cop, and he says, "Isn't that illegal in Rhode Island?" And the cop said, "I don't see anything. You know, you don't want to get involved." And so then he called up Colvin and the police chief, and anyway, they threatened to blow up the Narragansett Times if he didn't expose every other person who was running a roulette wheel in the state. And he wrote this four-page story about it. It's great. In 1980, a bunch of restaurants down the line, like Schiller's and whatnot, were upset because they were getting in trouble with the town, and apparently the paper was covering it, liquor license violations, etc., and they threatened to boycott, do an advertising boycott. The whole thing kind of fizzled out. I don't think they ever really did. In 1985, I did a series on substandard housing, and some people were very upset by how I characterized their housing. It was a big meeting, and that was a big deal. And then in the 90s, when I was the editor, I must have editorialized against the teachers, which is probably never a good idea. And then I became one. It was a period of time when the teachers were getting 6% raises, but we were starting to go into a recession. And again, our correction was kind of a correcting time, but there was a threatening and advertising boycott. And you never want to have the publisher come tell you that people are not advertising because of some story or some editorial. This is the list of editors as I could come up with it. I hope I didn't leave anybody out. So Jerry from 1962 to 76, before he went to the Journal. Angelo Cataldi took over for him. Angelo Cataldi ended up working at the Philadelphia Inquirer and becoming this big sports personality. Bob Hawkins from 1978 to 1981, he ended up at San Jose Mercury News, I think. John Salima, who had been editor of the Charlotte Times, then took over. He was there when I was first hired. Tim became editor. He was there for that whole twice-a-week transition. Sandy Drew was the first female editor. She had been assistant editor at the Standard Times, and the reason she only stayed for a short period of time is her husband, who was also in newspapers, got transferred to Massachusetts, and they moved, and that's when I became editor. And then when I left, Mike Pear took over for me. It might have been somebody between him and Marcia, I'm not sure. Marcia O'Brien was a longtime newswoman, also in the Hall of Fame. Joel Barrett, the late Matt Lunch, Gabby Folletta, and now Seth Bromley is the executive editor. And these are just some, this is how the flag has changed over the years. Okay, so the first motto, truth against error, victory or death. Then, an independent family paper. They really toned it down a little bit. They probably got complaints about the first one. Then for a long time, it was the Narragansett Times and Washington County Advertiser. This was in the late 19th century. Then we see the appear by 1900. That's when they dropped the Washington County Advertiser. This is in 1941. And then this cartoonish Indian showed up, which has not aged well at all. I don't know where that came from in the 1960s. And this is 1980. This is the last year that's digitized. So but the flag is pretty similar to this now, I think. Okay. Top stories, what are the huge stories the paper covered? Well, obviously the hurricane in 1938. They did get the paper out. It might have been a day late, but they did get the paper out. And this is when John F. Kennedy died. And the reason the paper looks, this is called turning the rules. When there's some kind, like when Lincoln was assassinated, in the hot lead days, normally there'd be like a hairline line there between the columns. And you turn the rules, the thick edge shows, it's a sign of mourning. And Fred himself wrote this column, we dubbed it mourning, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, because obviously he was so tied to him, and it had something to do with the paper. So that was a dark day. The sinking of the comet. This was a charter fishing boat that had a very weakened hull. Somebody bought it, didn't know really how bad it was. The person who was chartering it was not certified as a captain. Hang on, I can tell you if I did the escape, I can tell you how many. 12 died, 4 missing, 11 rescued. Really, this is 1973. And Angela Petroli has the lead story. And the death of Jason Foreman. Jason Foreman missing, and the arrest of Michael Levinson was, probably the worst crime story the paper had to cover, and they covered it extensively. Elizabeth 78, again, the paper came out. The paper always comes out, right? They pushed, they got it out on time. Obviously, there were all kinds of problems, power outages and whatnot. Some people had to walk in, etc. Here's a picture. This is a Newspaper Week 1975, I think. That's Jerry Goldstein at the far end. Just a few people here I can identify. Here's Rick. That's Dave Parada, who's a photographer. Rudy's way over there at the end, and he's next to Nancy Reed. Marilyn Murphy, long time. Arlene, I think that's you. And Jim Fiore, I think that's Dan Mackey, and Barbara Davis, longtime proofreader. And then we have this fun picture. This is mostly the editorial staff. Greg Berkey, Arlene, that's Linda Taylor. There's Rick in the back, there's Rudy, that's Anna Borsay, there's Tom Plimaser, Marcel Dufresne, and his wife at the time, Marion, and there's a bunch of people here I don't know. I think that's Dave Gregorio leading down. So this is a tight-knit group, and as hard as they worked, they had a lot of fun. So that's me back in the day. I'd just like to take a minute just to thank some of the people who helped me this at the South County History Center, Erica Luke, Jessica Wilson, as always, of the South Kingston Public Library. All of the issues up to 1980 are digitized. You should go through them. It's just really interesting to look through them. Rick and Jamie Wilson. Rick, unfortunately, couldn't be here tonight. Jerry Goldstein, Brian Mitchell, anyone who gave me these photos and documents, and thank you to the 300th Anniversary Committee for this opportunity.